The job posting was a digital ghost, lingering on a third-tier employment website under the bland heading Maritime Security Officer, Repositioning Contract. The pay was the only thing that wasn't bland. It was ludicrous, enough to clear my debts, buy a few years of freedom, and most importantly, put 1,000 miles of salt water between me and the wreckage of my old life. My career in IT had ended not with a bang, but with a server migration error and a pink slip. My life had become a series of silent beige rooms. The idea of patrolling another kind of silent beige room, albeit a floating one, for that kind of money felt less like a job and more like a lottery win. Stepping onto the MS Odyssey for the first time was like walking into a dead king's tomb. She was a leviathan of steel and faded glory. In the main embarkation lobby, the air was thick with the smell of old polish and dust. Sunlight struggled through the salt-crusted windows of a grand atrium, illuminating dust motes dancing over acres of dark red carpet, worn thin in pathways trod by millions of ghosts in floral shirts and sun hats. Everything was covered. The grand piano in the corner was draped in a white sheet, resembling a sleeping animal. The reception desks were shrouded. The casino's slot machines stood in silent, shrouded rows, like a mechanical army awaiting an order that would never come. The silence was the most unnerving part. A place this vast, built for the constant cacophony of 3,000 laughing, shouting, living people, was utterly, profoundly quiet. The only sounds were the distant, low thrum of the engines deep in the ship's belly and the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the superstructure as she swayed in the harbor. My new boss, the chief of security, was a man named Jonas. He fit the ship perfectly. Old, weathered, and seemingly held together by a quiet, stubborn gravity. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, and they held a weariness that went far beyond lack of sleep. He shook my hand, his grip firm but brief. "Alex," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Welcome aboard the Odyssey." He gave me the tour. We walked for what felt like miles through deserted passenger decks, grand ballrooms with stacked chairs, and cavernous dining halls where the tables were set for phantom guests. "Most of the crew is skeletal," he explained, his footsteps echoing alongside mine. "Engineers, a few navigators, galley staff to feed us. 50 souls maybe. Your job is simple: patrols, checking logs, making sure nothing is amiss. On a ship this empty, your biggest enemy will be boredom." Back in the small functional security office, tucked away behind the glittering facade of the main lobby, he pushed 2 items across the metal desk. The first was a thick, glossy binder with the cruise line's garish logo on the front. The official manual: fire safety, emergency procedures, corporate nonsense. Read it for the insurance guys. The second item was a single, dog-eared card, laminated in cheap yellowing plastic. It felt heavy in my hand, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. The text was typed, faded, and stark. "This," Jonas said, tapping the card with a thick finger, his gaze unwavering, "is for you. These are the rules that matter." I looked down at it. There were only 5. Never answer a greeting if you cannot see who is speaking. Voices carry in empty halls. Between 2:45 and 03:15 is the dead hour. You must be in the security office or your locked quarters. Monitor the cameras, but do not, under any circumstances, leave these rooms. If you smell salt water and damp rot inside the ship, particularly on the upper decks, turn around immediately. Log it as a containment breach in your report and choose another route. Do not investigate. The stage curtains in the Royal Theatre are to remain closed at all times. Verify this on your patrols. Do not attempt to open them. You will see people who are not on the crew manifest. We call them the displaced. You will know them when you see them. Do not engage, do not acknowledge them. They are merely echoes. I read the list twice, a slow smile creeping onto my face. I looked up at Jonas, expecting a shared laugh. "Okay, I get it. The new guy hazing." Jonas didn't smile. His weary eyes seemed to look right through me. "There is no hazing on this ship, Alex. Follow the rules. All of them. That's the entire job." He stood up, the meeting clearly over. "Your first shift starts at 22 Tonksy. Get settled in. And remember," he added, pausing at the door, "the ship is old. She makes noises. Don't let your imagination get the best of you. My cabin was small, Spartan but clean. I tossed the glossy manual into a drawer and placed the laminated card on the small bedside table. I couldn't help but feel a little insulted. I was a professional, not some kid who believed in ghost stories. The displaced. Containment breach. It was all so theatrical. Clearly it was a tradition, a set of superstitions passed down from one bored security guard to the next to break the monotony of walking empty corridors for 8 hours a night. I decided to humor them. It was, after all, their ship. The first night was exactly as I expected, profoundly boring. I walked the endless repeating hallways of the passenger decks, my flashlight beam cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The carpets, patterned with hideous swirls of gold and burgundy, muffled my footsteps, making me feel like a ghost myself. I passed hundreds of cabin doors, each one a sealed mystery. I checked on the shrouded casino, the empty pools on the Lido deck covered by heavy tarps, and the silent Grand Theatre. I stood outside the heavy doors of the Royal Theatre and shone my light on the thick velvet ropes that held them shut. Everything was as it should be. The silence was my only companion, broken only by the hum of the ship's ventilation and the groan of metal as the Odyssey met the gentle swell of the open ocean. When 02:45 rolled around, I dutifully returned to the security office as the rules dictated. I made a fresh cup of coffee and watched the bank of monitors displaying grainy, black and white images of empty hallways, empty lounges, and empty decks. Nothing moved. For 30 minutes, the ship was a still life painting. At 03:15, I resumed my patrol feeling ridiculous. I was a highly paid babysitter for a sleeping giant of steel. It was on my second night that the giant began to stir in its sleep. I was on deck 10, the ambassador's row, where the most expensive suites were located. The air up here was supposed to be the most filtered, the carpets the thickest, the fixtures real brass. But as I turned a corner, a smell hit me so powerfully it made me gag. It was the unmistakable, gut-wrenching stench of low tide. Briny saltwater, rotting seaweed, and the cold, damp smell of stone that has been submerged for a century. It made no sense. We were in a climate-controlled environment, hundreds of feet from the ocean's surface. This wasn't a scent, it was an invasion. Rule number 3 slammed into my mind. If you smell salt water, turn around immediately. My logical brain fought back. It had to be a leak. A broken pipe from the sanitation system, maybe. Her problem with the HVAC drawing in outside air. I was a security guard. Investigating anomalies was my job. The official manual would tell me to find the source. But Jonas's dead serious expression floated in my memory. Log it as a containment breach and choose another route. My curiosity warred with a primal sense of wrongness. The smell was getting stronger, and with it came a distinct biting cold that had nothing to do with the ship's air conditioning. I took another hesitant step forward, my light beam dancing across the ornate wallpaper. That's when I saw them. On the plush, burgundy carpet, a dark spot was forming. It glistened wetly under my flashlight. Then another appeared a few feet in front of it, and another. They were footprints, bare human footprints, forming one by one out of thin air, soaking into the dry carpet, as if an invisible, dripping person was walking slowly, deliberately down the hall, away from me. My blood turned to ice. My throat tightened. This wasn't a leak, this wasn't a prank. My mind, the logical, ordered mind of an IT professional, was screaming, trying to find a variable, a line of code, an explanation for what my eyes were seeing. There was none. The footprints continued their impossible march, leaving a wet, dark trail that smelled of the deep ocean, before stopping abruptly in front of a solid, wood-paneled wall. As if the walker had simply passed right through it. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the sound of my own heart hammering in my ears. I slowly began to back away, my feet clumsy, my flashlight shaking. I needed to get out of there. I needed to follow the rule. As I turned, a sound, clear as a bell, whispered directly beside my right ear. It was the light, innocent voice of a young child. "Hello!" My entire body convulsed. I whipped around, swinging my heavy flashlight through the space where the voice had been. There was nothing. Just an empty, silent corridor, the opulent wallpaper, and a trail of wet footprints that led to a solid wall. The cold air was gone, the smell of the ocean was gone, but the chilling echo of that impossible friendly greeting lingered in the air, a final, undeniable proof. This ship wasn't just empty, it was occupied. I scrambled back the way I came, my professionalism shattered, my logical world completely capsized. Back in the sterile safety of the security office, I stared at the laminated card on the desk. The faded type seemed to mock me. They weren't rules, they were warnings. And I had just stumbled right into the heart of the first one. Something is terribly wrong on the SS Odyssey. The things you're told to ignore are the only things that feel real. I don't know what's out there in the dark, but it's watching and it's learning. If you want to find out what happens when you break the rules on a ship that has a mind of its own, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Honestly, I don't think I want to be alone out here. Sleep offered no escape. When I finally collapsed into my narrow bunk, my mind replayed the incident on Deck 10 in a torturous loop. The creeping dampness on the carpet, the impossible footprints, the disembodied child's voice. I woke up gasping, the phantom smell of briny rot still clinging to my nostrils. The official explanation I tried to construct in the harsh light of my cabin's fluorescent bulb was pathetic. A freak condensation event, a trick of acoustics in the empty vessel. But my own senses, the very tools I used to navigate reality, screamed that it was a lie. I was a man of logic, of systems and predictable outcomes. What I had witnessed was a system breach of reality itself. The next day, I cornered Jonas as he was overseeing the refueling checklist in the ship's administrative office. I tried to sound casual, professional. "Morning, Jonas. Quick question about the HVAC on the ambassador's deck. I noticed a significant temperature drop and a very strong odor last night. Like seawater, I was thinking maybe a coolant line cracked or there's a problem with one of the sea intake filters." Jonas didn't look up from his clipboard. He just made another tick with his pen. "The upper deck climate control is a closed loop, Alex. No sea intake. It's probably just the system cycling. These old ships have quirks. You'll get used to them." "The thing is," I pushed, my voice tighter than I wanted, "I also saw something. Moisture on the carpets. It looked like footprints." He finally stopped writing and lifted his head. His grey eyes were flat, devoid of curiosity or concern. They were like stones. "Condensation," he said, the word a dismissal. "Pipes sweat when the external temperature changes. It pools. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. It sees faces in clouds and footprints in puddles. Stick to your patrol route. Note any actual equipment malfunctions. Leave the ghost hunting to the cable TV shows." His condescension was a wall. He wasn't just dismissing me, he was warning me. Later that day, I tried a different approach with a grizzled engineer named Dmitri, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease. I found him in a loud, vibrating maintenance corridor deep in the ship's hull. "Ever notice any weird stuff on the upper decks?" I shouted over the engine noise. "Strange smells, sounds?" Dmitri stopped wrenching a massive bolt and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. He squinted at me, his expression shifting from neutral to guarded. "My job is pipes and pistons, security down here. You worry about what's up there." "I'm just saying," I pressed. "Last night was strange. I heard a voice." The wrench in his hand clattered to the steel floor. His face, already ruddy from the heat, paled. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled me into a small, quieter alcove. "You do not talk about that," he hissed, his accent thick. "Not ever. You do your job. You walk. You watch. You see nothing. You hear nothing. You understand? This ship, she pays well, but she asks for in quiet. You be quiet, you get to shore, you make noise, the ship makes noise back." He released me and picked up his wrench, refusing to meet my eyes again. The message was clear. They all knew. The 50 souls on this floating tomb weren't a crew, they were 50 tight-lipped conspirators, and I was the unwelcome outsider who had just spoken the forbidden name of their god. My isolation was no longer just a consequence of being on a ship in the middle of the ocean. It was a deliberate, enforced quarantine. I was alone with the phenomenon, and my supposed colleagues were my jailers. My IT background was my only remaining weapon. If the crew wouldn't talk, maybe the ship's systems would. The security office had a secondary terminal, an older model used for archiving. The main system only stored patrol logs for the last 6 months, but I suspected the raw data, the unedited incident reports, were backed up somewhere deeper. It took me the better part of an afternoon, but I finally bypassed the standard user interface and gained access to the raw server directories. I felt a grim satisfaction, like I was finally back in a world of predictable logic. What I found was a digital graveyard. Years and years of security reports, filed under the names of men who were no longer here. The official logs were clean, sterile. Deck 11 patrol complete, all secure. But the informal shift notes, the ones buried in hidden text files and mislabeled folders, told a different story. Guard, M. Peterson. Date, 17/10/2018. Note, auditory anomaly reported from Grand Ballroom. Sounds of piano music. Confirmed ballroom empty and locked. Logged as HVAC resonance. Guard, R. Sanchez. Date, 03/02/2020. Note, sensory event on Lido deck. Reports of children's laughter near the covered pool. No children on board. Attributed to wind acoustics over the tarps. Guard, J. Cole. Date, 21/09/2022. Note, containment breach, Deck 10. Olfactory and visual disturbance consistent with previous events. Guard is shaken. Recommending 2 days shore leave at next port. There were dozens of them. HVAC resonance. Wind acoustics. Condensation. The same bland technical excuses Jonas had given me, used over and over to paper over a history of terror. The turnover rate for my position was staggering. Most guards didn't even last a full 6-month contract. One file, belonging to a man named Marcus, the guard I had replaced, was the most disturbing. His notes started out like mine, professional, detailed, but they slowly devolved. Marcus, note 45. Another breach. Stronger this time. The smell it's getting the scent of me. Marcus, note 61. I think it's learning. It used to be random echoes. Now it feels targeted. I hear things from my childhood. Songs my mother sang. Marcus, note Manu 73. The reflections are wrong. It's in the reflections now. That last line sent a tremor of cold dread through me. The reflections. I thought about all the polished brass, the dark glass of the shop windows in the promenade, the hundreds of mirrors in the staterooms and lounges. The ship was a funhouse of reflective surfaces. The phenomenon, it seemed, now knew it was being watched, and it decided to watch back. It started subtly, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision as I passed a large polished brass column. I'd turn and see only my own tense, pale face staring back. Then, I caught it again in the dark glass of a display case containing grotesquely expensive watches I could never afford. For a split second, my reflection's expression didn't match my own. While I was frowning in concentration, my reflection was smiling. A wide, predatory grin that was gone before I could fully register it. I told myself it was sleep deprivation, paranoia, the power of suggestion from reading Marcus's unhinged notes. I tried to avoid looking at my own reflection, focusing on the carpets, the ceiling, the door numbers, but the MS Odyssey was designed for vanity, a floating palace of glass and gloss. Avoiding my own image was impossible. The escalation came a few nights later. I was in the Dynasty restaurant, a vast 2-story dining room with a sweeping central staircase. The place was an ocean of empty tables draped in white cloths, a forest of inverted wine glasses gleaming in my flashlight beam. A massive floor-to-ceiling mirror covered the entire back wall, designed to make the already enormous room feel infinite. As I did my sweep, I kept my back to it, my skin crawling with the feeling of being watched by an army of myself. My radio crackled. It was Jonas. "Alex, there's a pressure alarm tripping in the aft ballast control. It's probably a faulty sensor, but I need you to go take a look." "On my way," I said, relieved for the distraction, for a real, tangible problem to solve. I turned to leave the dining room, and I made the mistake of glancing at the mirror. My reflection stood there as it should, but it wasn't me. Not exactly. This version of me was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his uniform dark and heavy with water. Dark, stringy bits of what looked like seaweed were tangled in his hair. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. They were wide with an unspeakable, abyssal terror, the eyes of a man who had seen the bottom of the ocean and found something waiting for him there. As I watched, frozen in horror, the drowning man in the mirror lifted a shaking hand and pressed it against the glass from his side. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was a silent scream, a desperate, pleading gesture. Then, just as quickly, the image was gone. It was just me again, bone dry, my hand half raised in a pathetic echo of the gesture. I stumbled out of that dining room, hyperventilating, my entire worldview cracking apart. This wasn't a haunting. A haunting has rules, a history. This was something else. An active, intelligent, and deeply malicious force that was peeling back the layers of my own identity. It was using my own face as a mask. My fear solidified into a new kind of resolve. I wasn't just going to survive this trip, I was going to understand it. I became obsessed with the rules, following them with a zealot's devotion. They weren't a joke. They were the only thing keeping me sane, the only firewall between me and it. The dead hour from 02:45 to 3:15 became my sanctuary. 30 minutes where I could lock myself in the security office and not have to face the ship's corridors. 30 minutes of watching the dead, silent feeds from the cameras. Tonight, the dead hour felt different. A storm was brewing outside, and the ship was beginning to pitch and roll in the heavy seas. The groans of the hull were louder, more insistent. I sat at the console, nursing a bitter coffee, my eyes scanning the grid of monitors. Hallway, empty. Lounge, empty. Deck, empty. Theatre. I leaned closer. The camera for the Royal Theatre was a fixed shot, aimed down the central aisle towards the grand stage. The heavy crimson velvet curtains were drawn, just as rule number 4 dictated they should be. But something was wrong. In the grainy, low-light image, I could see them moving. It wasn't the sway of the ship. That was a slow, rocking motion. This was a subtle, rhythmic flutter, like the gentle breathing of a slumbering beast. My blood ran cold. I stared, unable to look away, as the movement became more pronounced. The two halves of the massive curtain, which must have weighed a ton, began to slowly, almost sensually drift apart. A gap formed in the center, an inch, then 2. It was opening. The camera wasn't good enough to see what was on the stage behind it. The gap revealed only a perfect, featureless, and absolute blackness. It wasn't the normal darkness of an unlit space. It was a void. A patch of night that seemed to drink the camera's infrared light, a blackness so profound it felt like a hole in the world. As the gap widened to perhaps a foot, the lens of the camera on the monitor began to fog over. A white crystalline frost bloomed in the corners of the image, spreading rapidly inwards, as if the temperature in the theater had instantaneously dropped to far below freezing. The audio feed from that camera, which had been nothing but a low hum, was now picking up a faint, high-pitched whining sound, like feedback or pressure building. Then, just as I thought I saw something, a shape, tall and impossibly thin, beginning to emerge from that slice of utter black, the screen erupted in a blizzard of static. The feed was dead. I sat back in my chair, my body trembling uncontrollably. Rule number 4 wasn't "don't open the curtains." It was "the curtains must remain closed." A simple yet crucial difference. It implied that it wasn't an order for me. It was a state of being for the theater, a form of containment, and something inside had just decided to test the lock. The static-filled screen was a declaration of war. My 30 minutes of sanctuary were over, not because the clock had run out, but because the thing being contained had just reminded me that locks only work on things that acknowledge them. The dead hour was no longer a reprieve. It was a countdown. I felt a profound tectonic shift in my own psyche. The logical IT professional, the man who sought explanations in faulty sensors and acoustic anomalies, was gone. He had died somewhere between the impossible footprints and the silent scream in the mirror. In his place was something more primal, an animal in a trap, sniffing the air for the scent of the hunter, knowing its only goal was no longer understanding, but simply surviving until sunrise. I couldn't stay in the security office. It felt like a fishbowl. The dead camera in the theater was a blind spot, a gaping hole in my awareness, and my imagination filled it with a tall, thin silhouette stepping out of a tear in reality. I needed proof, not for Jonas, not for the crew, but for myself. I needed something tangible, an anchor to hold on to in this swirling vortex of madness. Marcus's notes were the key. His descent into paranoia so closely mirrored my own. Where would a man who believed he was being hunted by the ship itself hide his last will and testament? Not in his cabin, not in the main office. He would have taken it somewhere the others wouldn't look, a forgotten place. My patrol routes had given me a detailed mental map of the Odyssey's passenger-facing areas, a labyrinth of decaying luxury. But the ship had a whole other anatomy, a subterranean world of steel and function I had only glimpsed. The ship's original schematics, stored as PDF files on the server, showed a handful of decommissioned storage rooms and auxiliary stations on the lower decks, near the deafening thunder of the engine block. One was labeled Security Substation C. It had been marked offline since 2015, a perfect place to hide a secret, a perfect place to die. Making my way down into the ship's guts was a journey into a different element. The cold, silent dread of the upper decks was replaced by a suffocating, oppressive heat and an all-consuming noise. Down here, the MS Odyssey was brutally alive. The air tasted of ozone and hot diesel. The walls vibrated with the colossal power of the engines, a constant bone-jarring tremor that made my teeth ache. I navigated a maze of narrow, greasy corridors, ducking under thick bundles of cables and hot, hissing pipes. The only light came from caged yellow bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows. I felt like I was being digested, moving through the intestines of some great metal beast. I found Substation C behind an unmarked, heavy steel door. The handle was stiff with rust and disuse. It took all my weight to force it open, and it screamed in protest, a shriek of metal that was still somehow swallowed by the engine's roar. The room inside was a time capsule. A thick layer of dust covered everything. An old, bulky CRT monitor sat on a desk like a skull. The air was stale, motionless, but it was the chair that drew my attention. It was knocked over, lying on its side as if someone had left in a violent hurry. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was his place. This was Marcus's final sanctuary. I started my search. The drawers of the desk were empty, save for dried-up pens and fossilized paperclips. I ran my hands along the metal shelves under the desk, behind the dormant equipment. Nothing. My hope began to curdle into despair. Then I saw it. Tucked away in a small maintenance locker in the corner, almost completely obscured by a mess of old coiled cables, was a standard-issue ship's toolkit. It was cleaner than everything else in the room. I opened it. Beneath a tray of wrenches and screwdrivers was a dark grey tablet computer, its screen scratched but intact. I took it back to the relative safety of my own cabin, locking the door and wedging the chair under the handle. My hands were trembling as I plugged it in. The battery was dead, but after a few agonizing moments, the screen flickered to life. There was no password. The home screen had only one folder labeled Log. Inside were dozens of video files, dated sequentially. I took a deep breath and played the first one. A man who must have been Marcus stared back at me. He looked like his crew photo, mid-40s, tired but professional, a small, weary smile on his face. He was in his cabin, the same model as mine. "Log entry 001, he said, his voice steady. "First week of the repositioning cruise. Everything is quiet. Exceptionally so. The crew seems competent, if a bit insular. The list of unofficial rules is clearly a long-running gag. Still, I'll play along. For now." I skipped ahead, jumping through files. For the first few weeks, his demeanor remained the same. Calm, professional, slightly amused by the ship's quirks. He documented the piano music, the scent of salt water, all with a detached, analytical tone. Then, around log entry 034, the change began. The man on the screen was different. He was paler, thinner. Dark circles ringed his eyes. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Log entry 034. It's not a gag," he whispered, his eyes darting towards the door of his cabin. I saw one of them. The displaced. an old woman in a dated dress standing in the middle of the promenade. I looked away for a second and she was gone. But she wasn't transparent. She was solid, real. And the way she looked at me, it wasn't a memory. It was hungry. I felt a knot of ice form in my stomach. I skipped further ahead. Log entry 052. Marcus was frantic now. His hair was damp, though it wasn't raining in the video. He kept wiping his face. The reflections. My God, the reflections. It's not me in there. It's a drowned version of me. It's showing me how I'm going to die. I tried to talk to Jonas and he told me I was cracking under the pressure, threatened to have me sedated. He knows, and he's leaving me out here for it. He leaned closer to the tablet's camera, his eyes wide with a terrifying, revelatory fire. I have a new theory. These things, the echoes, the smells, they're not ghosts of the ship. They're symptoms. The ship is sick. It picked up a disease somewhere, a parasite in its steel soul. It's not haunted, it's possessed. I'm calling it the ship's thirst. Because I think it's trying to drink me. The final video file was dated just 3 days before I boarded. The transformation was complete. The man on the screen was a wraith. His face was skeletal. His skin had a waxy, waterlogged pallor. He was sitting on the floor of his cabin, and he was soaking wet, water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders. But the room around him was perfectly dry. Log entry 078, the last one, he rasped, his voice a broken shell. I was wrong. It's not a parasite, it's a place. An intelligence as vast and as cold as the deep ocean. It latched onto us decades ago, and it's been sleeping, dreaming, but now it's waking up. It tastes the world through us, through our memories, our fears, and it's developed an appetite. He gave a wet, rattling cough. It doesn't want the ship, it wants the shore. It wants to get off this floating prison and walk on land. It wants to spread. The displaced, the reflections, they're just its feelers, its taste buds. It's learning how to be human by dissecting us. It showed me what it wants. It needs a vessel, not just the ship, a body, a mind to pilot. It's been measuring me. His gaze seemed to look through the screen, through time, directly at me. God forgive me. I think I'm the one it has chosen. The video ended abruptly as the cabin door in the background creaked open, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness. Marcus's eyes widened in ultimate horror, and the tablet clattered to the floor. The last thing the microphone picked up was the sound of rushing water like a dam breaking. I stared at the black screen, my own reflection a pale, terrified mask. This was it. The proof, the explanation. It was a truth so monstrous it dwarfed any ghost story. We were not on a repositioning cruise. We were a quarantine vessel, carrying a cosmic plague across the ocean. And the security guard wasn't here to protect the ship. He was the designated lab rat. My shaking fingers found one last file in the folder. It wasn't a video, it was an audio file named simply Communion. My curiosity, a morbid suicidal impulse, was too strong to resist. I hit play. The recording was filled with static and the low thrum of the engines. Then I heard Marcus's voice, trembling but clear. He sounded like he was pleading. What do you want from me? Just tell me what you want. There was a long silence. Then a new sound began to fade in. It was a deeply unsettling, layered noise. On the bottom was a low, resonant thrumming, like the call of a blue whale resonating through miles of water. Layered on top was a crackling, whispering static, like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the sound of something ancient and utterly alien trying to approximate a voice. The sound built in intensity, and just when I thought my eardrums would burst, it coalesced. It resolved itself with horrifying, perfect clarity into a soft, familiar human voice. A voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. It was my mother's voice. It spoke a single, gentle phrase, the exact words she used to whisper to me when I was a child, afraid of the monsters under my bed. "Don't be afraid of the dark, my son." I threw the tablet across the cabin. It smashed against the far wall, the screen shattering. But the sound was already inside me. It wasn't a recording of my mother. It was a perfect imitation. The entity on this ship, the abyssal intelligence Marcus had called the ship's thirst, had reached directly into the deepest, most sacred corner of my memory and plucked it out. It had worn my mother's voice like a costume. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was inside my head, and it was telling me not to be afraid of the very thing it was made of. The shattered screen of the tablet mirrored the state of my mind. The voice, my mother's voice, stolen and worn like a cheap suit by something ancient and obscene, had severed the last thread connecting me to a rational world. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for theories. There was only the chilling, absolute certainty of a violation. The entity wasn't just in the halls or the mirrors. It had a key to the rooms inside my skull. Panic was afire in my veins, but beneath it, something else was forged in that blaze, a cold, hard, incandescent rage. I was done being the rat in the maze. I was going to find the maze maker. Clutching the fractured tablet like a weapon, I stormed out of my cabin. The ship seemed to respond to my fury. The low hum of the engines deepened into a guttural growl. The gentle creaks of the hull sounded like the stretching of sinews. I didn't care. I navigated the corridors with a singular predatory focus. I found Jonas, not in his office, but in the ship's deepest sanctum, the engine control room. It was a cathedral of noise and heat, a stark contrast to the dead silence above. Banks of humming computers, blinking lights, and analog gauges stretched from floor to ceiling. Through thick glass windows, I could see the colossal pistons themselves, rising and falling in a hypnotic, earth-shaking rhythm. Jonas stood before a central console, his back to me, studying a pressure schematic on a monitor. He was the calm center of this mechanical hurricane. Condensation, was it? I shouted over the din, my voice cracking. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He saw the broken tablet in my hand, and for the first time a flicker of something, annoyance, resignation, crossed his features. "You should not have gone looking for that," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the noise. "What about wind acoustics, Jonas?" I advanced on him, holding up the tablet. "Or Havak resonance? What's the technical explanation for this? What's the corporate-approved excuse for a monster that knows my mother's name?" He looked at the shattered screen, then back at me. The weariness in his eyes seemed to deepen, to become something geological, as if he carried the weight of centuries. "There is no explanation," he said, his voice devoid of deception now. "Not one your world has a word for. Some things don't have explanations. They simply are. And we are simply here." "Who's we?" I demanded. "The crew? You've all been lying to me since I stepped on this rust bucket. You're all in on it." "In on it?" A dry, mirthless chuckle escaped his lips. "You think we're its partners? Look at these men." He gestured to the two engineers across the room, their faces grim and perpetually slick with sweat as they monitored their gauges, never looking our way. "Look at me. We aren't partners. We are the keepers of a cage. And the cage is floating in the middle of nowhere. We are the guardians of the silence." His words hung in the hot, vibrating air. "Guardians?" I spat. "You're feeding it." "Marcus knew. He called it the ship's thirst. He said it wanted to get off, to reach the shore. You're letting it happen." "Marcus was a fool," Jonas said, his voice hardening. "He did what you are doing. He tried to understand it. He shone a light on it. He spoke to it. That is the one thing you must never do. You don't reason with a hurricane. You don't negotiate with an earthquake. This presence, this thing as it's been with the ship for 80 years, it's part of the steel, part of the rust. During normal voyages, with thousands of passengers, their noise, their thoughts, their emotions, their dreams, it's like white noise. It keeps the presence diffuse, sleepy, content. But when the ship is empty like this, it gets quiet, and the thing wakes up. It gets curious." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "The rules, Alex, they aren't a manual for your survival. They are a ritual of appeasement, a catechism. We walk certain paths. We stay silent at certain hours. We ignore the echoes it puts out. We show it nothing of interest. We bore it back to sleep. We are a crew of ghosts, trying our best not to be noticed by the one true ghost." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The conspiracy of silence, the evasive answers. They weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to protect the ritual, My investigation, my fear, my refusal to accept the silence, I was a discordant note in their desperate lullaby. And the entity had noticed. As if summoned by the thought, the nature of the ship around me began to unravel. It started with the lights on the control panel. They began to flicker in time with my racing heartbeat. The solid steel floor beneath my feet felt soft for a moment, spongy like a bed of wet sand. I stumbled, catching myself on a railing. "It knows you're afraid," Jonas said, his eyes watching me with a clinical detachment. "It can taste it now. You've made yourself interesting." His voice seemed to come from very far away. The overwhelming roar of the engines was fading, being replaced by a different sound, the gentle rhythmic wash of waves on a shore. I looked past Jonas, through the thick glass window at the giant moving pistons. They were no longer steel. They were dark, wet rock, covered in glistening kelp and pale, writhing anemones. The engine room was gone. I was standing in a vast sea cave, the tide pulsing in and out around machinery that was half corroded metal, half living coral. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head. "It's not real, it's in your head." When I opened them again, the engine room was back, but the hallucination had left a residue. A thin film of moisture now coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of low tide and decay. My own personal containment breach, following me everywhere. From that moment on, I couldn't trust my senses. The ship became a waking nightmare, a landscape of shifting, malevolent suggestions. Hallways would seem to stretch into impossible dark distances as I walked them. I would catch glimpses of strange bioluminescent things flitting in the shadows. The faces in the faded oil paintings of the ship's captains would turn to follow me as I passed, their painted eyes filled with a drowning man's panic. The auditory assault was worse. It had my mother's voice, and it used it as a scalpel. I would hear her humming a lullaby from the other side of a locked cabin door. I would hear her call my name softly from the end of a dark corridor, a siren's song daring me to investigate. It layered in other voices from my past. The angry shouts of my ex-girlfriend from our final fight, echoing from the speakers in an empty lounge. The disappointed sigh of my father, seeming to come from the ship's own ventilation system. It was a psychological vivisection, laying bare every fear, every regret, every failure I possessed, and playing them back to me in a symphony of torment. I was unraveling, and the crew knew it. They began to avoid me entirely. I would see them in a hallway, and they would turn and walk the other way. I was a leper. I was contagious. The focus of the entity's attention was now entirely on me, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast radius. After 2 days of this relentless psychological siege, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept. I barely ate. I just patrolled. A ghost haunted by ghosts. My hand never far from the cold, solid weight of the mag light I carried, as if its meager beam could keep the abyss at bay. I was in the security office, staring blankly at the monitors, when Jonas entered. He placed a new tablet on the desk in front of me. "I think you need to see something," he said, his voice flat. "So you understand what you've done." He tapped the screen. A video file opened. The timestamp was from the previous night, around 04. The camera angle was from a corner of the ceiling looking down. I recognized it instantly. It was my cabin. I stared, confused. There were no official cameras in the crew quarters. "We don't just watch the ship, Alex," Jonas said quietly. "When necessary, we watch the bait." On the screen, I saw myself asleep in my bunk, a fitful, thrashing shape under a thin blanket. The video was silent, grainy, and tinged with the green of night vision. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then, the door to the small closet in the corner of the room began to creak open. It opened with an unnatural slowness. Not a person, not an animal. It was a shape that emerged. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a creature. It was more like a pocket of distortion. A human-shaped column of visual noise like the air shimmering over hot asphalt, only this was a shimmer of cold, deep space black. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs long and fluid. It didn't walk. It flowed into the room, its presence seeming to bend the light around it. My sleeping form on the bed was oblivious. The shape drifted to the side of my bunk. It stood over me for a long time, motionless. Then, one of its long, wavering arms lifted. A hand-like appendage, A blur of static and shadow reached down. It didn't touch me. It hovered an inch from my face, as if tasting my breath, as if reading the dreams behind my closed eyes. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity. Then, it slowly retracted its arm and flowed back towards the closet, dissolving into the shadows within before the door silently drifted shut. I stared at the screen. My entire being turned to a block of ice. I had felt watched. I had felt hunted. But I had believed on some fundamental level that my locked cabin was a sanctuary. To see that it had been in there with me, inches away, studying me like a specimen, it was a violation so profound, it defied words. I looked up at Jonas, a single, desperate question in my eyes. "What is it?" He switched off the tablet, the screen going dark. His face was grim, a mask of cold, hard reality. "It's the new passenger," he said. "You broke the rules. You didn't just look at the abyss, you shouted into it. And it heard you, you made yourself known, you invited it to the table." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a final damning whisper. "And now, Alex, it wants to eat." The video didn't just frighten me, it liberated me. The image of that silent, shimmering void standing over my sleeping body severed the last anchor of fear. Fear requires a sliver of hope, the possibility of escape. But there is no escaping something that can flow through a locked door and stand beside you while you dream. There is no hiding from a monster that has already made a home in your memories. All that was left was a terrifying, crystalline clarity. The Guardians of the Silence, with their rituals and their rules, were not trying to defeat this thing. They were managing a terminal disease. Their goal was not to save the patient, but to ensure the quarantine held until they could find the next one. Marcus wasn't the last victim, he was just the last volunteer, and I had been recruited to take his place. My new reality was stark and simple. The crew would not help me. The ship was actively hostile, and the entity was no longer just observing, it was closing in for the kill. I was out of options, which meant only one course of action remained. If I couldn't save myself, I would burn the prison down with me inside it. My plan was desperate, a final, defiant act of a cornered animal. The ship had a long-range emergency communication system, a powerful high-frequency radio located on the bridge. It was designed to cut through any interference, to send a distress signal that could reach coastal authorities from anywhere on the planet. I would get to that radio. I would broadcast everything, the ship's name, its coordinates, a frantic, raving account of the entity, of Marcus, of the crew's conspiracy. I would sound like a lunatic, but it wouldn't matter. A distress call from a vessel of this size cannot be ignored. It would force a response. A Coast Guard cutter, a helicopter, another ship. Someone would have to come. And that would break the quarantine. That would be my revenge. The bridge was the ship's nerve center, located at the very front of the highest passenger deck. It was also the most secure location on the vessel, but my security access card would get me through most of the doors. The real challenge was the journey. To get there from my cabin on the lower crew decks, I would have to traverse the entire length of the ship's superstructure, and I would have to do it during the deepest part of the night, when the entity's influence was at its peak. It would be a gauntlet. I waited until 01, when the ship was deep in its slumber. I armed myself with the heaviest maglite I could find, a poor weapon, but its weight was comforting, and my keycard. Stepping out of my cabin felt like stepping off a cliff. The corridor was silent, but it was a predatory silence, the stillness of a jungle just before the pounce. The ship fought me from the very first step. The architecture itself seemed to warp in protest of my passage. Hallways that should have been straight now appeared to curve gently into darkness, tricking my sense of direction. The patterned carpet seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, the ugly swirls of gold and burgundy coalescing into staring, malevolent faces before dissolving back into chaos. Then came the displaced. They were more numerous than I had ever seen them, as if my desperate mission had called them out of the woodwork. They stood in the corridors, in the lounges, in the middle of staircases. The old woman in the dated dress, a man in a ship's steward uniform from the 1950s, a young couple holding hands, their evening wear immaculate, but their eyes hollow and ancient. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood like silent, sorrowful statues, their heads turning in perfect unison to follow my progress. They were a gallery of the damned, and their collective gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on me, urging me to stop, to lie down, to join their silent vigil. I pushed past them, my heart hammering, whispering a mantra to myself. They're not real, they're echoes, just echoes. But the entity had more than just atmosphere in its arsenal. It began to attack my sense of self. I entered the 2-story atrium, the site of my first terrifying encounter with my drowning reflection. As I passed the wall of polished brass panels, I caught my image. This time, I didn't see a victim. I saw a monster. My reflection was twisted, its limbs too long, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. Its face was mine, but stretched into a silent, screaming rictus of agony, its eyes black, empty pits. It mirrored my movements, a grotesque puppet of myself, a promise of what the entity intended to make me. I broke into a run, refusing to look at any other reflective surface. The most insidious attack came in the grand ballroom. I had to cross its vast, empty floor to reach the forward stairwell. The room was dark, the dozens of tables and chairs covered in their ghostly white sheets. As I reached the center of the room, a sound cut through the silence. It was the faint, tinkling melody of a child's music box. The tune was familiar, a lullaby my mother used to play for me. It seemed to be coming from the stage. Against my better judgment, my flashlight beam swept towards the source. In the center of the vast, dark stage, a small, ornate music box sat on the floor, its lid open, its tiny ballerina pirouetting in my light. And sitting cross-legged beside it was the little girl in the white dress, the one from the rules, the one I had glimpsed on my first night. Her back was to me. She was gently rocking back and forth in time with the sad, tinny melody. My blood turned to ice. Rule number 5. Do not engage, do not acknowledge. I started to back away, but the music box suddenly clattered shut. The melody stopped. The little girl stopped rocking. An awful silence descended on the ballroom. Then, very slowly, her head began to turn. It kept turning, past her shoulder, past the point where a human neck should be able to go. The bones in her spine making a series of soft, wet popping sounds. It turned almost a full 180 degrees until she was facing me, her body still pointing towards the stage. Her face was a pale porcelain mask in my beam, but her mouth was a slash of darkness, stretched into a smile so wide it nearly split her cheeks. No sound came from her lips, but a voice echoed through the cavernous room, a composite of every voice the entity had ever stolen from my memory, my mother, my father, my ex-girlfriend Marcus, all speaking in a horrifying layered unison. "Are you lost, Alex?" I screamed. It wasn't a word, just a raw animal sound of pure terror. I turned and fled, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that impossible smiling face. I burst through a set of double doors and found myself in a service corridor, my lungs burning, my mind on the verge of shattering. Somehow, through sheer blind panic, I found the final stairwell. I scrambled up the last few decks, my legs numb, my only thought the bridge, the radio, the final act of defiance. I burst through the last door and stumbled onto the bridge, and froze. The bridge was not empty. The main lights were off, but the soft, multicolored glow of dozens of instrument panels and radar screens illuminated the figures of Jonas and 3 of his most senior officers. They were standing there, waiting for me, their expressions a mixture of pity and grim resolve. There was no aggression in their stance, no sense of confrontation. They looked like an honor guard waiting for a condemned man. The long-range radio was on a console near the front viewport. I could see it from the doorway. It wasn't just off. Its main console had been pried open, and the delicate circuitry inside was a mess of deliberately cut wires and smashed vacuum tubes. It was utterly, irrevocably destroyed. "There's no one to call, Alex," Jonas said, his voice soft, almost kind. The sudden gentleness was more unnerving than any threat. "No one is coming to help." I stared at the broken radio, then back at them. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. The gauntlet, the horrors, the race through the ship. It wasn't an obstacle course. It was a test. This was a trap, I whispered. the realization dawning. All of it. Jonas nodded slowly. It was an evaluation. We had to be sure. He gestured towards the massive wraparound viewport that formed the front of the bridge. It looked out onto the night sea, but as I stared, I realized something was profoundly wrong. There were no stars, not a single pinprick of light in the sky, and the ocean below wasn't reflecting the ship's navigation lights. It was a perfect, flat, non-reflective black, a patch of absolute void. It wasn't water. It was the same hungry darkness I had seen behind the theater curtain. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice trembling. The question felt impossibly small in the face of that infinite emptiness. Jonas stepped aside, revealing something I hadn't seen before tucked away in the darkest corner of the bridge. It was a single chair, unlike any of the others. It was a heavy, metallic thing, more like a medical restraint device than a pilot's seat. Thick, heavy cables snaked from its base and headrest, connecting to a dedicated humming console that was dark, save for a single pulsing red light. "You're asking the wrong question, Alex," Jonas said, his voice filled with a terrible ancient sorrow. "The question isn't where we are, it's when. We're in the dead hour, and every night during that time, the ship isn't sailing on the ocean." He pointed a single trembling finger at the featureless void outside the viewport. "It's sailing through it, and tonight you are going to be our navigator. They tell me the ship is lost. They say we are not in our own ocean, but adrift in some other place, the place that lives inside the ship. They didn't bring me to the bridge to kill me. They brought me here for a job interview. My real job. They say I'm the only one who can guide us back. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think the terrible truth behind all this really is. Because I'm strapped into a chair that feels like an electric throne, and I think I'm about to find out, and I don't think I'm going to like the answer." The hum of the strange console beside the metallic chair was the only sound on the bridge. The roar of the engines, the groan of the hull, the whisper of the ventilation, all of it was gone, swallowed by the profound, absolute silence of the unspace outside the viewport. My frantic, adrenaline-fueled struggle had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, lucid dread. This was not a climax of violence. It was a ceremony. "It's not an entity in the way you think of one, Alex," Jonas said, his voice a low, somber lecture in the unnatural quiet. He didn't look at me, but at the chasm of nothingness outside. "It's not a ghost. It's not a demon. It is a place, a dimension, a consciousness so vast and so alien that it perceives our reality as a brief, flickering shoreline on its infinite ocean of being. 80 years ago, this ship, in a storm, in an uncharted stretch of the Pacific, blundered through a thinning of the veil. It snagged itself on a psychic reef. It came back wrong. It brought a piece of the ocean with it." He turned to face me, his eyes filled not with malice, but with a bone-deep exhaustion, the fatigue of a man who has kept a terrible secret for a lifetime. During the dead hour, the veil thins again. The ship doesn't move in physical space. It slips. It returns to that place. And that place is chaotic, unnavigable. To a machine, it is pure static. To an unprepared mind, it is instant, catatonic insanity. "But it's a consciousness," I whispered, the pieces falling into place with the force of a physical blow. "It's sentient." "Yes," Jonas affirmed, gesturing to the chair I was now approaching, not by force, but with a zombie's mechanical dread. Two of the other officers flanked me, their movements slow and practiced. "It is sentient and lonely and ravenous for stimulus, but it is also navigable, if you have the right kind of lighthouse." He pointed to my head. "It needs a focal point, a human consciousness, complex and bright and terrified, to act as a beacon. A mind to hold on to the concept of home, the memory of a physical shore, while the ship passes through the storm of its thoughts. The watcher does not pilot the ship with their hands. They pilot it with their soul. They dive into that ocean of alien thought, feel its crushing pressure, its timeless despair, its impossible memories, and they find the one current, the one thread that leads back to our world." My struggle had not been a fight for my life. It had been the final, most grueling part of the interview. They needed to see if I was strong enough to face the phenomena without shattering. They needed to see if the entity would focus on me, accept me. My terror was my primary qualification. There was no struggle as they guided me into the chair. My body was a remote object, a thing I was observing from a great distance. The metal was cold against my back. Restraints, smooth and worn from use, clicked into place over my wrists, ankles, and chest. The final piece was a heavy, helmet-like apparatus that they lowered onto my head. A crown of wires and cold metal contacts. Marcus was the last watcher, Jonas said, his voice sounding like a priest administering last rites. He was strong for many voyages. But the exposure erodes you. The tide gets inside. He couldn't find his way back anymore. The journey through the abyss was taking longer each time. We were getting lost. We needed a new anchor. We needed you. He stood before the console connected to my chair. He looked me in the eyes, and I saw a flicker of genuine pity there. I am sorry, Alex. The cycle must continue. The silence must be kept. He flipped a single heavy switch. The first sensation was not pain. It was pressure. A crushing physical weight that felt like the entire ocean was being poured into my skull. The hum of the console became a roar that was inside my head, a sound that had texture, a sound that was made of grinding static and the tectonic groaning of a dying star. The soft glow of the bridge instruments dissolved. My vision was flooded with a color that had no name, a shade of black that was filled with shimmering geometric impossibilities. My mind, my sense of I, my entire life as Alex, was a sandcastle against a tidal wave. I felt it break apart, not into pieces, but into grains. My memories, my identity, my fears, they were no longer mine. They were just data, loose information released into a vast thinking ocean, and the ocean was tasting them. I felt a consciousness, if such a word could apply, press in from all sides. It was ancient beyond comprehension, its thoughts not linear words but entire eons of cold, silent, patient waiting. I felt its immense, unending loneliness, a solitude so profound, it was a physical force. I felt its hunger, not for flesh or life but for pattern, for story, for the fleeting warmth of a structured mind in its endless chaos. And then, I became more than myself. My consciousness, now unbound, merged with the ship. I was the steel of the hull, feeling the non-water of the abyss slide against me. I was the electricity in the wires, a phantom nervous system. And through the ship, I was connected to the entity itself. I was drowning in it. I felt its memories, which were the memories of the ship. I was a wealthy woman in the 1970s, the melancholic piano music my only solace before the final cold embrace of the Atlantic. I was a little girl in a white dress, separated from my parents, my small cries for help echoing unanswered through hallways that twisted and turned into a labyrinth with no exit. I was Marcus, feeling the last of his sanity dissolve as he willingly stepped over the railing, answering a call that promised an end to the terror. I felt every tragic death, every secret sorrow, every ounce of despair that had ever soaked into the vessel's decks, all preserved perfectly within the entity's memory, replayed not as a story, but as raw, undiluted sensation. This was the job, to endure this, to be all of them and still remember the one, to be Alex. Amidst the screaming symphony of a billion alien thoughts and a century of human suffering, I felt a flicker, a tiny, insignificant memory from my own shattered mind. My mother, humming a lullaby, not the one stolen by the entity, but a different one. A simple, quiet tune. It was a single pure note in an ocean of dissonance. A pattern, a direction. I latched onto it with the entirety of my dissolving being. It was the lighthouse, the shore, the memory of home. I pushed, not with muscles but with will. I pushed that single, fragile concept of reality against the overwhelming tide of the abyss. The ship, which was me, groaned in protest. The entity, which was also me, recoiled, intrigued by this strange new stimulus. For a moment that lasted an eternity, there was a terrible cosmic tug-of-war in the space where my soul used to be. And then I felt the ship lurch. The impossible color behind my eyes began to recede. The pressure lessened. The roar in my skull subsided to a hum. Faintly, I saw the glow of the bridge instruments returning, like distant stars being born. We were coming back. The last thing I experienced before my awareness collapsed was a final, clear thought that was not my own. It was a feeling of ancient curiosity and a nascent, terrifying affection projected from the abyss into my mind. It was a single, soundless word. Mine. Light. Harsh, unforgiving sunlight streamed through a porthole. The air was warm and smelled of salt and diesel fumes from a nearby port. The gentle rocking of the ship was back, the familiar motion of a vessel at anchor. The voyage was over. We had arrived at the shipyard. I was sitting in a wheelchair, a thick blanket draped over my lap. 2 crew members were pushing me down a gangway. I could see Jonas at the bottom, clipboard in hand, speaking to a new official. And walking up the gangway towards the ship was a young man, early 30s, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He had a look of nervous optimism on his face, the look of a man starting a new, high-paying job, a man ready for an escape. He nodded politely as he passed my wheelchair. I did not nod back. They wheeled me to a waiting, unmarked van. Jonas came over and crouched down in front of me. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You did well, Alex," he said, his voice soft. "You were the best navigator we've had in a long time. You'll be taken care of, a quiet life, comfortable, everything you need." I looked at him. I tried to speak, to scream, to warn the new man who was now stepping onto the deck of the MS Odyssey. But my mouth wouldn't work. My mind was a calm, silent, vast expanse. The terror, the rage, the grief, it was all gone. There was nothing left of Alex but a quiet, hollowed-out room. A room with an ocean view. Jonas seemed to understand. He gave my shoulder a final paternal squeeze before standing up and walking away. As the van door slid shut, plunging me into shadow, I felt a strange sensation on my cheeks. I lifted a hand, my movements slow, disconnected. My fingers came away wet. I was crying, but the tears were not warm. They were cold, and they tasted unmistakably of the sea. The cycle would continue. The silence would be kept. The ship would get its repairs and soon it would sail again, with a new watcher learning the terrible truth in its haunted, hungry halls. But I was at peace. My job was over. And yet, it was not. A part of me was still back there, in the cold, silent dark, forever adrift. And a part of that dark was now here, looking out through my eyes. I am the watcher. I am the tide. And I am thirsty.